Good morning. My name is Myron Franz, Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget. I'm joined today by State Economist Laura Kolumbakidis and Budget Director Margaret Kelly to present the November forecast. MMB's forecast documents are available online at mn.gov/MMB under the Forecasts and Updates tab. We are here to present, can I do the slides? Yes, we are here to present the November forecast for the state budget. And I'm pleased to tell you that we continue to project a positive balance for the remainder of this biennium and for the next biennium. The forecast balance for the next biennium, 2018-2019, is $1.4 billion. As required by law each November, we added 33%, or $334 million of the forecast balance for 2016-2017 to the budget reserve. This adjustment brings our budget reserve balance to a little over $1.9 billion, which is very close to our recommended reserve target of about $2 billion. This does not count the cash reserve account of $350 million. Budget Director Kelly will show you a slide with those computations. So you'll recall that at the end of session, we estimated $729 million were in the bottom line for 16 and 17. And that has increased to $1,012 million, $1.012 billion, of which we multiplied to 33% times to get the $334 million reserve target allocation. These numbers have not changed very much since our last forecast in February. We believe that this budget forecast reflects the result of sound fiscal management year after year. This forecast may sound boring to you all, but trust me, in this case, boring is good. Because boring today means our budget remains stable and structurally balanced. Let me demonstrate this. This forecast is our 7th in a row with a balanced budget. And we are again forecasting budget balance for the next 2 biennia. Let's compare 2016 to 2011, when Governor Dayton took office. At that time, we owed billions of dollars to our schools and faced a $6 billion deficit in January 2011. Let me assure you that I prefer this boring forecast over that scenario in 2011. By focusing on sound fiscal management, we have restored our state budget to one Minnesota can be proud of. We paid back our schools over $2 billion that we owed them. We increased our tax revenues and in the process made our taxes more fair. We increased our budget reserve to the largest in state history. We strategically invested in early education, our K-12 system, colleges, training programs, and more. We managed our state budget so that our spending does not outpace our revenues, the very essence and definition of structural balance. Minnesota continues to be a success story. We have a diverse economy that continues to grow, but more slowly. We have the 11th lowest unemployment rate among the states, and just last July, one of the rating agencies, Fitch, restored Minnesota's AAA bond rating. But let's talk about what this forecast does and what it does not do. One thing that this forecast does is look at the state as a whole. And as a state, Minnesota is doing well. Many states would envy this budget forecast today. What this forecast does not do, however, is show the disparities that still exist throughout our state. Across Minnesota, we see disparities in education opportunities, healthcare access, and jobs. This is unacceptable. For example, the Department of Employment and Economic Development's county unemployment data from October shows that Koochiching County in northern Minnesota has a 7% unemployment rate, while Olmsted County in the southeast has a 2.6% unemployment rate. We must work to ensure that all Minnesotans have the opportunities to take part in our job growth, in our growing incomes, and in our excellent schools, colleges, training programs, and universities. We must include more individuals and families in health care that works for them. The health and vitality of our state is not a metro versus greater Minnesota issue. We are one Minnesota, and we need to make sure our efforts benefit everyone who calls this great state home. We have made incredible progress over the last 6 years, but our work is not done. As you know, there are many different types of risk or uncertainties in a forecast. This forecast is somewhat more challenging because every 2 years we forecast in November for the next biennium 6 months before it even begins. So today we are forecasting out 54 months, and a lot can happen in 4.5 years. I'm now going to turn it over to Professor Kolombakidis to provide details about the economic outlook, revenue projections, and forecast risk.
Thank you. I'm going to, the chart's already there. I'm going to start with the U.S. outlook, talk a little bit about Minnesota, and then move on to revenues. The first slide shows the annual percentage change in U.S. real GDP growth, both the history and November's forecast in the dark bars, and February's forecast in the light bars. This is the forecast by IHS Markit, Minnesota's consulting firm. The first thing I want to do is point out that the IHS November U.S. outlook was released on November 7th. So it does not reflect possible post-election U.S. policy changes. There's considerable uncertainty in this forecast about which policy changes may be enacted in the coming years and the economic impact of those changes. IHS has said that they're examining the president-elect's policy proposals and examining the probability of their being passed, and as things become clear, they're going to incorporate those policy changes into their outlooks. Until then, the impact of potential policy changes on several key economic sectors, including energy, banking, international trade, healthcare, immigration, those things remain sources of uncertainty in this forecast. So the outlook for U.S. economic growth has weakened since we prepared our forecast in February. A reduction in business building and equipment purchases in the first half of this year slowed U.S. economic growth for this year. And you can see that the largest change is early in the forecast in 2016. IHS has decreased their forecast for real GDP growth in 2016 from 2.4% in February's outlook to just 1.5% now. Lower forecasts for consumer spending and for business capital purchases reduced the 2017 growth forecast from 2.8% in the February outlook to 2.2% now. Aside from the policy uncertainty I just mentioned, I want to note another source of risk to this forecast, and that is that the current economic recovery and expansion period is mature. It's well into its 8th year. If growth continues into mid-2019, and I would note that growth is continuing in this outlook, so IHS and other macro forecasters are forecasting continued U.S. growth. But if that growth continues until mid-2019, this will be the longest expansion for the United States. Then, looking back at the chart, note that the level of growth, or the rate of growth that they're forecasting, is in the 2.2% range. This is well below the historical average of 3.1%. So the 20-year average prior to the Great Recession, average real GDP growth was 3.1%. And so this is long expected that we were going to be in a slow growth era, but I just want to point out that we're there. And slow growth in a mature expansion makes an economy more vulnerable to shocks, reducing its capacity to weather an unexpected downturn. The primary reason for the change in the forecast economic growth in 2017 is a reduced expectation for growth in consumer spending. This chart shows IHS's forecast for real consumer expenditure growth. Again, the dark bars are the history and the November outlook. The light bars are February. So IHS has lowered their forecast for 2017 real consumer spending growth to 2.5% from 3.1% in February. Spending growth is lower in each subsequent year as well. This change is due to IHS's lower expectations for disposable income growth through 2019. And they also changed their outlook for housing demand. They're kind of slowing their expectations for how quickly young people are going to be separating from their parents and moving out and getting their own homes. And that has reduced their expectation for purchases of big consumer durable items like furniture, refrigerators, things like that. Indeed, in their outlook, we look at all of the different elements of our sales tax and what they expect consumer expenditures to be in all of those elements. And almost all of those have lower growth in this outlook than they had in February. And so you'll see that impact when I talk about the sales forecast. So in these last two charts, we see lower expected growth for real GDP and consumer spending, but both of the charts do show continued growth through our forecast horizon. So before I move on to Minnesota, I just want to point out that key aspects of the U.S. economy remain solid enough that IHS and other forecasters are continuing to forecast economic growth throughout our forecast period. Over the next couple of years, IHS expects wage growth to outpace inflation, and they expect that income growth, plus continued additions to employment, plus improvements in household balance sheets to all support the consumer spending growth that they forecast here. And consumer spending is going to continue to be the largest contributor to real GDP growth. Moving on to Minnesota. Well into this current long economic expansion, Minnesota continues to add jobs at a fairly steady rate, although the state's employment growth is seeing the effects of drags on exports and a tightening labor market. Consistent job growth has contributed to the state's declining unemployment rate, which is now at 4%. With strong demand for workers and low unemployment, Minnesota's labor market remains tight. The most recent data indicate that there were nearly as many job vacancies as unemployed job seekers statewide. The number of workers filing initial claims for unemployment insurance has fallen, and recent months have seen increases in the average hourly earnings of private sector employees. The chart shows annual growth in total Minnesota wage and salary income. So what you can think of this as growth in the whole payroll, all the payrolls of the entire state, all rolled in together. So as long as these bars are positive, that means that total wage and salary income in Minnesota is growing. So when there are changes, those are changes in the rate of growth, not that wages and salaries are falling. And these bars can grow, or this measure can grow, either if we have more people working, or if people are making more money per worker. And or if both of those things are happening. And in our forecast, both of those things are happening. Both employment is growing and average wages per worker are growing. So what you can see is that from the chart is that we expect total wage and salary income to grow modestly between 4 and 5% over the next several years. Another thing to note is that the gray bars and the dark bars are really very close together on this chart. That means that our prior forecast is very similar, our current forecast is very similar to our prior forecast. So there isn't much change in our forecast for wage and salary income growth relative to what we had in February. And you'll see the impact of that consistency when I talk about the income tax forecast. So this table shows our revenue forecast. For the current biennium, FY16-17, we have the November 16 forecast, so our current forecast for the current biennium in the far left column, and then the forecast change for that biennium, so that's the difference relative to prior estimates. And then we have the next biennium, FY18-19, again, the current forecast and the forecast change. Total general fund revenues for FY16-17 are now forecast to be $41 million more than the prior estimate. Higher expected corporate, statewide property, and other revenues offset lower forecasts for individual income and sales taxes. The current forecast for FY18-19 revenues is $467 million less than the prior estimate. The forecast change is due to lower expected individual income and sales tax revenues. As you saw before, our wage and salary income forecast changed very little since February. So the relatively small changes in the income tax forecasts, both these biennia, are primarily due to reductions in expected growth rates for non-wage income, such as dividend and interest income. We lowered the forecast for sales tax receipts by $107 million in the current biennium and $428 million in the next biennium. And that's consistent with the reduced forecast for U.S. consumer spending that you saw in the earlier chart. And it's also consistent with current fiscal year sales tax collections that have been lower than expected. I've already described some of the risks inherent in this forecast. I've talked about an economy that's in a long, low-growth expansion being vulnerable to unexpected external shocks. I've talked about significant uncertainty regarding U.S. fiscal, trade, immigration, and regulatory policy that hopefully will be clarified in coming months. Inflation is forecast to gradually rise from what have been very low rates, and that gradual rising is embedded in this forecast. But the risk is that if prices accelerate more quickly than this forecast expects or than the Federal Reserve feels comfortable with, subsequent actions by the Fed could lead to a different outcome than what we forecast here. Global growth will continue to affect Minnesota businesses that export manufactured goods and agricultural commodities and iron ore. And changes in trade policy could also have an impact that we can't forecast at the moment. And finally, you heard from the commissioner about the number of, the amount of time that we are forecasting for here. And none of the revenues that we have forecast here for FY 18-19 have been collected yet. So I will now turn to Budget Director Margaret Kelly to talk about the budget and expenditures.
Oh, no. Oh, there we go. I'm going to walk you through the spending changes in the forecast and then walk you through the impact that the spending and revenue changes will have on our budget and on our projections. So first, overall spending is reduced both in the current and next biennia compared to previous forecasts. On this chart, you can see 16 and 17, and then 18 and 19 are forecast and the change. Clearly, as you can see on this table, Health and Human Services spending is driving the savings that we're seeing on the spending side. Starting at the top of the table, education spending is virtually unchanged from the end of session estimates. Only a $3 million change on a $17 billion budget. And to use a sports analogy here, we stuck the landing. We're just seeing a little faster growth rate in the number of students, resulting in additional general education spending. Property tax aids and credits are also relatively unchanged from the end of session estimates, and we're just seeing minor fluctuations in the number and average size of property tax refunds. Health and Human Services spending changes are almost entirely healthcare related, and it's a result of two trends. First, lower enrollment in our basic healthcare services, and this is in all of our major enrollment categories: families with children, adults without children, and elderly and disabled. But in that latter category, we're seeing slower enrollment growth among the disabled and faster enrollment growth among the elderly. Overall, enrollment is still growing, just at a slower rate. The second trend that we're seeing is lower average payments for some of our home and community-based services. And these are services that keep the elderly in their home and out of our long-term care facilities. And in particular, one waiver service, our Community Access Disability Inclusion, or it's our CADI waiver. The caps were lifted last session, and so we had an influx of healthier individuals, bringing the average payment down. Our debt service projections are lower in the current biennium. When we went to market in August, we had a smaller bond sale than we had anticipated, and the rates were great. And so we have some interest savings on our debt service payments. In the next biennium, though, we are assuming that we will actually pass a larger bonding bill this coming session. Typically, in an odd year, we assume a small bonding bill, but given that there was no bonding bill last year, we're assuming an $800 million bill in this next legislative session. So that increases the debt service costs going forward. So how did these spending and revenue changes impact the bottom line? For fiscal year 16-17, the biennium that we're currently in, we had anticipated a $729 million balance at the end of last legislative session. It's a number in the left column. When we officially closed the books on fiscal 16, we ended that fiscal year ahead of projections. And this gain in fiscal year 16 offset the lower revenue projections for fiscal 17 that Dr. Kolumbakidis talked about, resulting in a small $41 million revenue gain in this forecast. Spending is also lowered in the current biennium, which brings us to a positive balance for fiscal 16-17 of $1.012 billion. And current law allocates 33% of that to our budget reserve. So we put $334 million into the reserve today, leaving $678 million on the bottom line, just $51 million less than we anticipated at the end of session. So this balance is going to contribute to the next biennium. So for fiscal year 18-19, the budget that we're going to be putting together, governor recommendations coming out in January, we're now estimating a $1.4 billion balance. 467 million lowered revenues in fiscal year 18-19 compared to our previous forecast, offset by 152 million of spending reductions, leaving us with 376 million less than we were anticipating at the end of session. And this will set the stage for the next budget. So looking ahead, this is the first time we are projecting revenues or spending estimates for the 2021 biennium. And like Dr. Kolumbakidis and Commissioner France said, this is pretty far out and these projections are pretty risky. So the table here compares the revenues that would be collected within the biennium to the current law spending that we are anticipating, obligations that we have within that same biennium. And you can see here that we're projecting a positive balance for both biennia. Revenues are growing at an average annual rate between 2018 and 2021 at about 3.5%. Spending is growing at 2.7%. So we have structural balanced budget in the current biennium, in the next biennium, and in the biennium way out there. Finally, we don't include inflation in our forecast with the exception of the few areas that we talked about earlier in education and healthcare, but it does impact the ability of state agencies to deliver current services. So inflation estimates in this forecast are higher than they've been in more recent forecasts. They've been in the 1.2 to 1.8% range. With this forecast, it's 2.4 to 2.6%. So our forecast is a current law forecast, meaning what are the obligations we have in law projected forward, taking the appropriations and adjusting them for those changes. A current services budget would accommodate some level of inflation to be able to continue to deliver the services we're delivering today. So clearly this inflation estimate, while it's very rough, will impact our ability to deliver services and changes the nature of the budget. But with that, I'm going to turn it back to Commissioner France.
Thank you, Professor Kolumbakidis and Budget Director Kelly. And as they've discussed, this forecast comes with a number of unknowns or risk or uncertainty, such as the U.S. policy or federal budget changes that come with every new president. But in Minnesota, we have to chart our own course. And I recommend that our budget priority must be to stay the course. Why is that? Well, over the term of Governor Dayton's administration, we have taken the necessary steps to ensure that our state budget is built on sound fiscal principles. For example, we restored our rainy day fund, made strategic investments to strengthen our economy, and we've striven to improve our service delivery to all Minnesotans. But now, in the face of a weakening economic outlook nationally, Minnesota remains in a strong budgetary position with an economy that continues to grow, although more slowly. So is this forecast a little boring for you all? Well, maybe it is, but at MMB, my colleagues and I love boring as opposed to unanticipated deficits. We will take a boring forecast any day if the alternative is instability. My advice for the 2017 legislative session: make sure that any budget changes maintain a positive structural balance now and in the future years. As we plan for the 2017 legislative session and the long term, Governor Dayton will review these projections and submit a budget in January. And we will now take questions.
Are there any suggestions you would have on how legislature, the governor should deal with the potential changes in Washington?
Yes.
Would you like to elaborate?
You know, I think the key here is it's just going to take time, and we have to be cautious and wait for things to develop in a way that really are actionable. You know, it turns out the last several presidential terms, every 8 years we've been changing presidents and parties of the president, so there's always a huge uncertainty when you do that. And this change is no different. What's different here is we know probably less than we usually do, and there's been a change in Congress as well. So I think we just have to wait and see and let these things develop in a way that really and give us actionable items to work on. IHS, as Professor Columbakidis mentioned, will be studying this, and we'll know more in the coming months. But we just can't anticipate too much, I don't think. I'd be cautious.
How the future would be different if the tax bill had been signed and if the bottom bill that was hung up had gone forward?
Well, clearly, we would have, the question was, how would this budget look if we had spent the money on the tax bill and if we had passed the bonding bill? Well, clearly, we would have fewer assets right now. That spending would have lowered our resources and the balance for this biennium. We haven't gone back to do that in terms of recast what would have happened, but I think the key is here that we have these resources now, and we have to make sure that if we're going to spend any resources in the future, that they fall within our budgetary constraints. So it would have reduced the budget balance.
If you come back to the national volatility, I mean, say Dodd-Frank is repealed, huge business tax cuts, do you throw all this out the window?
Remember, every forecast changes the next day, this afternoon, the next day. So as we progress toward the February forecast, we will be looking at those items, but we have to look at when they are passed, how are they passed. Any repeal of any law, you really have to look at the details in what's going to happen. So, nothing is out the window until something is passed or until it's, assured that it's going to be passed. So it's just one of those situations where we simply have to wait until there's more definite action.
On wage growth and the labor market. I was in the forecast, this bit about you expect wage growth because of the tight labor market. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Specifically, I mean, previous forecasts have forecasted lower wage growth. Do you see any bright spots there, and how important might that be to future revenue collections?
Sure. So a tight labor market simply means that we have high demand for labor and low unemployment. And that means that the people who are supplying the labor are in a position to potentially ask for higher wages. What that means is higher wages per worker, potentially. So as I said, total wage and salary growth depends on the number of people working and average wages per worker. What we expect going forward is the moderate 4.6, 4.7% annual growth that we have projected. But we also expect that going forward, more of that growth is going to be as a consequence of higher wages per worker than employment growth, because employment growth is constrained by this tight labor market.
Revenue projections, or is that a bright spot there?
Well, the impact on future revenue projections are right there in the revenue projections. So that's precisely what we expect, is that we expect average wages per worker to be increasing and for the state to continue to add jobs in this environment.
The shortage of labor now constraining our economy, and if so, what remedies should we be employing to deal with that?
So when you have high demand for labor and low unemployment, the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to have lower demand for labor. Like that would relieve the pressure, but you don't want that. You want the economy to keep growing. And so I think that going forward, and in this environment, the labor market's been tightening for a while. I think the employers who will thrive in this environment are the ones who can find, train, and retain workers. And they're all trying to do that. The employers are getting creative about making those matches. They're thinking about the skill sets and experience they really need. They're thinking about flexible work environments. They're looking to pockets of unemployed people that they might have overlooked before. And at the same time, employees are thinking about their options as well. So I think some creativity in order to loosen those constraints is already happening.
Disparities in Minnesota's economy. Could you address a little bit about what parts of Minnesota's economy are doing well and which parts are struggling right now?
It's a long question, long answer. The governor's here and ready to speak to you. And we're happy to talk to you after this is over, so please check with Janelle Tummel or Keith Hovis and look us up. But I'd like to, at this point, to turn the podium over to Governor Dayton. And you have thank you all very much.